Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. I am your host, Ryan Lee, and Week 4 of the NCAA season was an absolute doozy. Major upsets, high-flying action, and so much football to get to, including a recap of this past weekend's action, as well as the preview into Week 5's action. We also have another segment of Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is, our segment where we talk about the best and worst sports bets from throughout the week, and a new piece of betting terminology so you can be ready to place your bets going into this week. I will also be recapping my predictions from Week 4 as well as my predictions going into Week 5. Finishing off with the NFL Draft. Does it matter to the top programs in the country? Some of the top players, including Joe Burrow, Tua Tagovailoa, and CeeDee Lamb, did them leaving their programs actually affect their programs? Or do they seem to be doing fine without them? We're going to be finding out in just a bit, but first off, let's get right into it with the first segment going into this week, which is the Week 4 wrap-up. And there were a lot of big matchups, but the big thing is that there were just not only big matchups, there were some big upsets. And the thing is that it's one thing to have an upset, you know. You see it a lot in professional sports, you see it a lot in college sports all the time. And in terms of the upset department, one of the biggest frames of reference that people refer to when talking about upsets is all the way back in 2007 when the Appalachian State Mountaineers, a Division II school, actually upset the Michigan Wolverines. Yes, the University of Michigan, who in Ann Arbor, in Michigan Stadium, Michigan was supposed to be the hands-on favorite. Back in 2007, they were supposed to be the favorite, I believe, to win the entirety of the NCAA as a whole. The thing is that there was no betting line because the game was perceived to be so dominant by Michigan, and then this big thing happens where Appalachian State actually wins at the end. Like, who would have thought? You know, obviously that was 13 years ago, but it serves as a good frame of reference of what exactly defines an upset in this scenario. The way that I personally define an upset, at least for this week's set of games, is an unranked opponent beating a ranked opponent who they should have beat. And I also took it as who were the biggest favorites. So going back to the over-under discussion from past Saturday, who were the biggest favorites that fell? And I wound up coming up with two big upsets that really shook up a large chunk of the NCAA landscape. The first one I'm going to go to was between the number 3 team in the country, the Oklahoma Sooners, losing to the Kansas State Wildcats, who weren't even ranked in the top 15. Both teams go to 1-1. However, the Sooners, they actually fall to 0-1 in the Big 12, while Kansas State actually moves up to 1-0 within the Big 12. And of course, with all of the new stuff going on, you know, with the ways that the alignment is with these divisions and the way that the schedules are lined up, it is mostly interconference games, and we had a Big 12 matchup with the Wildcats and the Sooners. Let me break down exactly how this game went. Oklahoma coming into it was the heavy favorite, 27.5 points. Now, if you remember our discussion from last time, you will remember that 27.5 points is a absolutely phenomenally huge favorite to be, because when they say Oklahoma was minus 27.5, what they mean is that Oklahoma, statistically speaking, should have won by 28 or more, realistically going into this matchup. That didn't happen. Kansas State won 38-35. which, to be fair, a very formidable performance by Oklahoma on the offensive side of the ball. However, Skylar Thompson and this Kansas State team really brought it to the Sooners when they went into Oklahoma, I believe. And let me break down how this game exactly went. Oklahoma played a much better game than Kansas State in almost every single way, shape, and form. Literally every way, shape, and form, Oklahoma was better. Total first downs, 28-10 in favor of Oklahoma. Third down conversion percentage. Oklahoma was 7 for 12, equaling 58%. Kansas State was 2 for 11, equaling 18%. Advantage Oklahoma. Total offensive yards, 517 to 400. Advantage Oklahoma. Rushing yards, 130 to 66. Advantage Oklahoma. Passing yards, Spencer Rattler upped Skylar Thompson, 387 to 334. Advantage Oklahoma. Completion percentage, 30 for 41 for Spencer Rattler, 18 for 25 for Skylar Thompson, which is 73.2% versus 72%. Mostly a wash, but the advantage statistically still goes to Oklahoma. Time of possession is 32:08 to 27:52. Once again, advantage Oklahoma. You want to know the crazy part about all this? Oklahoma should have won this game. This is one of those defeats that is of colossal proportions. Yes, you can say it's college football. Anything can happen. I agree. However, what shouldn't happen is what happened to Oklahoma in this game. With literally 2:46 left in the third quarter, 17, almost 18 minutes left in the entirety of the game, Oklahoma could have had a chance to put the ball anywhere between the uprights in the end zone. They could have done something. They were up 21 with 17 minutes left to go in the game. They literally had this game on lock into the third quarter. Honestly, I don't know how Skylar Thompson was able to rally this Wildcat team back into the game, but somehow he did. And I think it's absolutely crazy that he did, because Skylar Thompson had 3 rushing touchdowns. And the thing is that Spencer Rattler, he had a good game. The big issue is his ratio. The TD to interception ratio was 4-3. 4 touchdowns is great. 3 interceptions is bad. And I even recapped how each interception went. The first one literally came in the first series of the game for Oklahoma, and that was a deflection that bounced into the hands of the defender. His second interception was a 50-50 ball that was in the second quarter that you can debate should not have been thrown because it was a 50-50 ball. And the third one, Rattler just simply threw it behind his receiver, Drake Stoops, and that landed right into the lap of the defender. That was literally with 34 seconds left in the fourth quarter. If Oklahoma wanted any shot at winning this game, Rattler should not have thrown that third interception because that was literally the game on the line. To be fair, Spencer Rattler is a freshman. To be fair, Lincoln Riley is great at developing quarterbacks. Look at the past 3 years of the level of quarterbacks he's had. Jalen Hurts is a second-round draft pick. And I don't think Hurts is a second-round draft pick if he doesn't transfer to Oklahoma and doesn't have that Lincoln Riley coaching because they made the Final Four last year. Kyler Murray won the Heisman. Baker Mayfield won the Heisman. Spencer Rattler is going to have the rest of this year plus the next 2 to learn under Lincoln Riley, who is very good at offense and is very good at developing his quarterbacks. Because Baker Mayfield was a transfer in, Kyler Murray was a baseball player, and Jalen Hurts was a transfer from Alabama after Tua, the eventual number 5 draft pick in last year's draft, took over his job. This was a crazy game, honestly. Had me on the edge of my seat pretty much the entire time. Drake Stoops, wide receiver for Oklahoma, had an absolutely amazing game. 3 receptions, 93 yards, and a touchdown. Thing is, Skylar Thompson reminds me a little bit of a quarterback that I personally know very well, and that is Josh Allen a little bit. Just because he likes to use his big arm, he's not afraid to make plays down the field. Sometimes he gets a little erratic with the ball. Sometimes his decision-making isn't the greatest, but both Allen and Thompson, they got better with time. I think Thompson was better at the end than he was at the beginning. But the thing is, they both can use their feet, and they're very powerful when they do run on the ground. Thompson's not as fast as Allen, but he is very powerful. And literally, I believe it was his second rushing touchdown. He barreled through 2 defensive linemen and dove into the end zone, which is a play that Josh Allen has made 100 times. Think of Thanksgiving last year against Dallas. Before I get in more into that, let me get into the second big upset of the week. LSU versus Mississippi State. LSU was supposed to be ranked number 6 going into the game on Saturday. Vegas gave them minus 14.5. So once again, going back to the discussion last time, Vegas believed that LSU should have won this game by 15 or more. But no, they lost by 10. Mississippi State was surprisingly even with LSU. First downs, 25-24, advantage LSU. Third down percentage, 8 for 16 for Mississippi State, 5 for 17 for LSU. That's 29.4%. That advantage goes to Mississippi State. Total yards, 632 to 425, advantage Mississippi State. Rushing yards, 80-9, advantage LSU. Passing yards, 623, advantage to KJ Costello and Mississippi State. And then you also had Miles Brennan, who got 345. The overall yardage, once again, goes to Costello and Mississippi State. And the completion percentages were surprisingly close. It was 60%, which was 36 for 60 for Costello, starting quarterback of Mississippi State. And then Miles Brennan, 27 for 46, which is 58.7%, which is not terribly far off as well. The Bulldogs kept this game very interesting because of the arm of KJ Costello. Clearly, something in the Bulldogs program had huge belief in Costello. And I almost forgot to include the fact that the Mississippi State Bulldogs led the LSU Tigers in time of possession 30-28 to 29-32. The difference is about 20 seconds. It's about 28 seconds, but advantage is an advantage. And the philosophy that I sometimes use, it doesn't matter if you win by 1 or 100, a win is a win. And I'm sure Mississippi State, they will gladly take their win over the number 6 team in the country because I believe now they're actually in the top 25. Yeah, they're number 16 now thanks to this win over LSU. So kudos to you, to the Bulldogs of Mississippi State. And I just want to get into a little bit, because KJ Costello had himself an absolute game. 60% on the completion, 623. 5 and 2 was the ratio for KJ Costello. And the thing is, Mississippi State had so many more standout players than LSU did. Because Osiris Mitchell and Kylan Hill were both absolutely outstanding for the Bulldogs. 7 reception, 183, and 2 touchdowns for Osiris Mitchell. And Kylan Hill, 8 receptions, 158, and 1 touchdown for the receiver tandem. And the thing is, Costello was able to work 3 more receivers into 100 yards, totaling 5. Meanwhile, all LSU had to a remote chance for an answer was Terrence Mitchell, who got himself 122 yards and a touchdown on 8 receptions. Mississippi State walked all over LSU. This is the one game that inspired my 4th segment, which is going to be, is the departure of college guys as impactful as it is to these top programs? It looked like LSU could have used a Thad Moss. It looked like they could have used a Justin Jefferson. They could have used a Clyde Edwards-Helaire. especially with 80 rushing yards. With only 325 passing yards from Miles Brennan, they could have used a Joe Burrow out there. It seemed like LSU was missing a lot of their top guys that were all drafted in this past year's draft. But I'm going to get a little ahead of myself because this is coming up in the final segment. Let's go into some of the other games of the week. So, Kentucky versus Auburn. Auburn was number 8 in the country, and they beat the number 23 Kentucky Wildcats 29-13. The Tigers had themselves an absolutely amazing game throughout, pretty much. The thing is that Kentucky really struggled to move the ball for the most part. Terry Wilson's one touchdown came over to Kavasi Smoke. And Smoke had himself a good day with 7 rushes on 62 yards for a touchdown. The thing is that Bo Nix was sharp. Bo Nix is a sharp shooter, and he tore up this Kentucky defense. Bo Nix, 16 for 27, literally equating to exactly 2/3. Bo Nix lit up this Wildcat defense. Literally 16 for 27, which equates to about 59.3%. 233 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 0 picks. Seth Williams and Eli Stove had absolutely amazing games with a combined 10 receptions, 167 yards, and 3 touchdowns between those two gentlemen. Bo Nix can absolutely carry this Auburn team. The big issue with Auburn, however, is they've got a very tough road ahead of them. And I picked this game for a specific reason, and it's partially because they were one of my picks for Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Was last week. And the thing is that Auburn, for the most part, kind of controlled this game. Going into the first quarter, Auburn made a very bold decision, which was after their touchdown, which went to DJ Williams. They decided to go to a 2-point conversion to go up by 8 immediately. That is a bold move. Analytics would support that, but I think it's the boldest move of the week. Because literally it upset the tide of the rest of that game. I chose these 3 games for a reason. Because 2 of the games had the biggest upsets in the week. Oklahoma should have won. Especially considering the fact that Oklahoma lost to Kansas State last year. And you would expect the Sooners to learn from their mistakes. But clearly, there's something about Kansas State, something about those Wildcats that Lincoln Riley chose not to go back into the tape for. Whatever that may be, I am not sure. But clearly it's something where Lincoln Riley chose not to go back into the tape. Because a lot of that had to do with just the determination that Skylar Thompson had. It's amazing how teams can have momentum. You know, they won the game before. Yay! However, the big thing about all of this is that teams like Oklahoma, teams like LSU, they get a little complacent. They relax. They're like, oh, it's just Kansas State. Oh, it's just Mississippi State. What are they going to do? They're not that big of a deal in the Big 12. They're not our biggest fear. Oklahoma's probably thinking, we got Texas to worry about. Or LSU is probably like, we got to get ready for Bama. We got to get ready for Georgia, Florida. LSU, we got this. Wrong. All wrong. 100% wrong. Wrong. This is how the best teams get upset. Is because they underestimate who their opponents are. Maybe they just got a little lazy. Maybe they're like, oh, easy dubs, easy win, you know. There's no reason for us to go all out. There's no reason to go with this crazy game plan instead of this crazy game plan. Poor planning a little bit of complacency, a little bit of laziness, I guess is a good way to word it. All reasons why teams like these lose to some teams who should not be up to the standard that they are. That is why Missouri State is now the number 16 team in the country right now. It is literally because I'm sure LSU, who is at number 6 by the way, just got lazy with it. It seemed like LSU, at least from what I could gather from the film, just didn't seem as into it as Mississippi State was. Because Mississippi State, they were doing all these crazy reads, all these crazy options, trying to not necessarily fool the defense, but giving LSU a lot of different looks and really being able to pick apart that zone and all the different formations very well. And the thing with Kansas State and Oklahoma was that they took advantage of a very spotty Oklahoma D, which left the zone coverage wide open. Just kind of a general thought to some of these big programs out there. Don't get complacent. Don't get lazy. Even against the worst teams, you gotta win those. Or else you can turn into a giant meme. Just like Appalachian State and Michigan. Just like Oklahoma and Kansas State did a little bit this weekend. You can just turn into a giant meme and people can just laugh at you. And no one wants that. And coming up right after the break, my preview into the Week 5's most important matchups, including Texas A&M and Bama, Auburn and Georgia, as well as Oklahoma and Iowa State. Why do these matter? Why do they play a role in the way that the conferences could pan out? Why do they matter to these top teams who are ranked? That's all going to be coming up right after this.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And we're back here on the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. Once again, with me, Ryan Lee. We just recapped Week 4's set of action in the NCAA, and we're going to be going right into Week number 5. Going into these matches and trying to figure out what I thought were the top 3 matches of the week, I tried to really limit it to a specific set of criteria, which is, number 1, in terms of the Vegas betting odds, which ones were the smallest? Yes, the smallest, because if any of these matchups have a small favorite, that means that the gap between these two teams are very small, which leads to a very interesting matchup. Let me put it this way. Imagine, I'll use a basketball analogy just for the sake of it. Let's say the LA Lakers, they made the NBA Finals this year. They've got LeBron. They've got Anthony Davis, 2 of the top 5 players in the league, in the entirety of the NBA, and then match them up against the Cleveland Cavaliers, who were the betting odds favorite going into the NBA draft lottery to get the number 1 overall draft pick. That's not going to be a very interesting match because there's going to be a highly expected winner out of that matchup. So that's why when I looked at the Vegas odds, I tried to think, number one, who has the smallest differential? That's why I came up with two very big matchups. Because each of them are only stated at about a touchdown difference, which is not big in football. And in college football, where everything's unpredictable, it's even smaller. And the third one is, which one is actually seems compelling, whether if it's from a story standpoint, whether if it's from a conferential standpoint, whether if it's just, these are the only top 25 teams playing against each other, what have you. I tried to switch it up. I tried to make things interesting. And honestly, I think I did a pretty good job at it. So the first week 5 matchup that I compiled is between the number 18 Oklahoma Sooners. Yes, they dropped 15 spots in the top 25 due to that one loss to Kansas State. Currently sitting at 1-1, 0-1 in the Big 12 versus Iowa State, unranked, 1-1. However, they're 1-0 in the Big 12. Oklahoma coming off of that devastating 38-35 upset versus Kansas State. And TCU had to host Iowa State, where they could not hold off the visiting Cyclones 37-34. This is a very interesting matchup for a multitude of reasons. Number one, Vegas has Oklahoma favored at only 6.5, which means 7 or more is what's going to win this game. And I think that's a very interesting number, considering the numbers they put up against Kansas State. They were phenomenal numbers almost across the board. You look at any sort of NCAA football game, the numbers that were put up at Oklahoma are absolutely phenomenal. However, the big issue was they still lost. And not in a very fun fashion either. Some could say embarrassing fashion, some could say unexpected fashion, but either way, it's a fashion you don't want to be in. And once again, the reason I chose this matchup is simple. This had tied with another matchup that I'm going to bring up soon. The lowest favorite in the week at 6.5. Let me break down some stats to you between these two Big Ten opponents, because numerically speaking, there's some massive discrepancy between these two. Now, let me lay a disclaimer out before I start listing these numbers. This matchup specifically is out of 2 games. I personally am a big believer in having a large sample size in order to show anything significant. The NFL, college football, I think there's nothing there. I do look at their stats, yes, but I honestly, crazily say there is little merit to those stats in my opinion. I studied psychology in college. Literally, one of the biggest things that they talk about when looking at statistics is you need significant sample size or else your stats are not that significant. But I have to pretend that they are for the sake of this show and for the sake of what the sports landscape is, especially in those early couple of weeks. 562 yards of total offense, which is second in the Big 12. Ironically enough, Big 12, only 10 teams, just a thought. 127 yards on the ground, which is 7th in the Big 12. First in the Big 12 is Oklahoma's passing offense at 435.5 points, and they're currently sitting at 4th in terms of points per game at 41.5 points. Iowa State, however, they're sitting at 363 yards of total offense, which ranks them 7th. In terms of passing, they're sitting at 178 yards, which is also 7th. Their rushing attack is currently 3rd in the Big Ten with 185.5 yards on average. And they are scoring an average of 25.5 points, which lays 8th in the Big 12, which is 2nd worst in the conference. Defense, however, it seems like this game is absolutely going to Oklahoma. 267 yards, 60 yards allowed on the ground, 267 yards allowed in total, 60 yards allowed on the ground, both of which are first in the Big Ten. 207.5 yards in the air is fifth in the Big Ten, and those 19 points against are fourth. While Iowa State, not so crazy on defense, 385 yards allowed, 108 of those on the ground, 277 in the air, and 32.5 points allowed. That is 7th, 6th, 8th, and 6th in terms of the rankings out of the 10 teams in the Big Ten. I chose this matchup because Oklahoma has something to play for again. You might think that after the Kansas State game, or at least going into it, I suppose, that Oklahoma really didn't have anything to play for in that game. However, I felt like they had a lot of things to play for in that game. Because ever since the Big Ten and the Pac-12 reintroduced themselves into the equation, we still have absolutely zero idea how this college football playoff picture is going to come about. We have zero clue how the Pac-12 and the Big Ten shakes everything up, whether they're going to change it into a win percentage type of deal, whether they just do it by the top 25 rankings, which is 95% based on the eye test. We don't know how they want to do it. But the reason I picked this game is that because of the way that Oklahoma's performed in the last several years, with Baker, with Kyler, with Jalen Hurts, Lincoln Riley literally made the Final Four last year, but lost to LSU. Especially considering how Oklahoma performed last year, where they won the Big 12, and they lost the Peach Bowl, which is the Final Four game, versus LSU, and got absolutely blown out 63-18. The thing is that the year before, when they had Kyler Murray, once again, winning the Big 12, and then losing the Orange Bowl, which is the top four, with Kyler Murray in the lineup. And then 2017, when they had Baker Mayfield in the lineup, they won the Big 12, and they lost the Rose Bowl, which in that year was their Final Four matchup. They've been in the Final Four the past 3 years, the Oklahoma Sooners have. And if they do not beat Iowa State, who is inferior to them statistically in every single category, Oklahoma's season is in big-time jeopardy. 12-2 in 2019, 12-2 in 2018, and 12-2 in 2017. And those were their last 3 years. Big 12 champions. Final Four. If Iowa State somehow either keeps it within that 6.5 or just can flat out beat Oklahoma like Vegas says they have a chance to, only 6.5, it's very doable. Oklahoma's season is essentially over. They have no chance at the Final Four if they cannot even win this year. The second big matchup I chose to focus on was number 7 Auburn versus number 4 Georgia, where both teams are currently sitting at 1-0 and 1-0 in the SEC as well. Georgia is currently the 6.5 point underdog, and out of the 14 teams in the SEC, currently Auburn, at least in terms of the 14-team SEC, they currently are gaining 324 yards, which is 11th out of 14, 91 yards on the ground, which is 9th, 233 in the air is 11th, and 29 points scored is 8th. Meanwhile, Georgia's offense is producing 387 yards, which is 7th, 121 rushing yards, which is 6th, as well as 266 passing yards, which is 7th, and their 37 points is 4th place. Now, for some reason, the SEC, I couldn't find any rankings on them, but I'll just give you the numbers flat out. In terms of the defense, Auburn is allowing more yards with 384 versus Georgia's 280. On the ground, once again, Georgia has the advantage with 77 yards versus Auburn's 145. And in the air as well, 203 to 239 advantage to Georgia, as well as points allowed, 10 to 13, also in favor of Georgia. However, I will not put a lot of merit on any of these stats because that's after one game. That's literally after Auburn beat Kentucky and after Georgia beat Arkansas. And this is the one game we have as their frame of reference, which to me means nothing. However, another big matchup that I personally wanted to focus on was Alabama, number 2 in the country right now, versus Texas A&M, currently sitting at number 13. Both teams 1-0, 1-0 in the SEC. In terms of the offense, Bama is currently ahead of total offense with 414 yards, which is 5th in the SEC versus Texas A&M's 376, which is 10th in the SEC. However, Texas A&M, they know how to utilize the ground so far relative to their conference counterparts, which is currently sitting at 2nd place in the SEC with 187 rushing yards versus the 111 that Alabama's putting up, which is 7th. Also 7th is a passing attack, 303 yards versus Texas A&M's 13th ranked passing attack at 189 yards. That is 2nd worst in the SEC. Now, the beneficiary is the fact that Texas A&M, not necessarily at the bottom, 19 points on offense. However, that's 10th place in 14th, tied with Missouri. And Bama is currently 3rd in points scored with 38. Now, defense, once again, no rankings I could find, but the numbers simply go like this. A&M has had a better total offense through one game at 255 yards versus the 322 for Alabama. However, Alabama's been much better at stopping the run game at 69 yards versus 105. And Texas A&M has been a stronger passing defense with 150 yards versus 253. And that's currently where A&M has allowed 12 points to Alabama's 19. And this is immediately following the fact that Alabama beat Missouri 38-19 and Texas A&M only beat Vanderbilt 17-12. This is going to be a very interesting matchup for multiple reasons. And I think one of the biggest ones is the fact that all 3 of these games, while for obvious reasons are interconference games, there's so much to play for. Because some of the other games, they're between an unranked opponent versus a ranked opponent, which to me is not as interesting as watching 2 of the top 25 teams of the country battle at it for the supremacy in their relative division or conference, etc. I find these matchups very intriguing because A&M and Bama could definitely shake up the way the SEC is played, especially with the way that if Alabama loses, they're debunked from number 2, and it shakes up the whole top 25. Auburn and Georgia are very close to each other, number 7 and number 4. These are literally 2 top 10 teams, and what they have done so far up to this point has been nothing short of extraordinary. And I think this is going to be a very high-flying, high-offense game where 6.5 in favor of Georgia might seem about right. I could see it coming to 1 score. I could see it coming maybe in the ballpark of 7-8. I could definitely see 6 as well. And Oklahoma, simply put, team in the nation. They were one of the top teams in the nation, literally top 3, top 4 for the past 3 years. And if they lose to Iowa State, number 1, Lincoln Riley's stock is going to plummet. However, it's not going to sink because they believe in Lincoln Riley. But one of the big things is that Oklahoma is going to struggle. They have an uphill battle. Literally, if they lose to Iowa State, they have to win every single game after that to even make par. Not to exceed expectations, to even meet them, because the bar has been set so high the last 3 years. Yes, once again, Spencer Rattler is a freshman, and I will give him a pass on whatever happens this year due to a simple lack of experience. However, when you have had a coach as good as Lincoln Riley, Oklahoma has got to figure something out to work around what Spencer Rattler's been good at. Or else their season is essentially over. That's a preview into the top 3 matchups of Week 5. And coming back after the break, the second installment of one of my personal favorite segments, Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is. We're going to be going over how the spread has looked last week, and as well as how my predictions seem to have worked out. And also, I'm going to go back into those top matchups of week 5, and I'm going to be giving you whether you should go over, whether you should go under, and a new piece of betting terminology coming up right after this.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
And we're back here once again on the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. Once again, with your host, Ryan Lee, and a segment that I am most certainly looking forward for is one that has come out of my own creation, known as Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is, the segment where I talk about the best and the worst sports bets of the week. Along with that, I teach you a little nugget about sports betting and sports betting terminology, so that way the next time you go to your nearest casino or your nearest sports betting website, you will just be that much more educated in that field. Let's get right into it. Once again, we just recapped the Week 5 matchups, which I'm going to be using as the frame of reference here, and I think one thing that needs to be said about the games from this past week is the fact that I think the one thing that needs to be said about the 3 games that I chose back in previewing week 4 is the fact that I did well, but at the same time, going back again to the statistics of the matchups for today, the small sample size does not matter. I went 2 for 3, which I personally am proud of, because anything over, in my opinion, at least 60% is respectable for any sports analyst like myself, just simply predicting games. What do you have it based off of? You have it based on numbers. You have it based on the eye test. However, every game is different, whether if it's a new venue, a new year, a new player, a new injury, even a new set of fans, even a new game plan by the coaches, etc., etc. I had 3 picks from throughout the week, and I'll just give you the first one here, if you remember from the last time we did this. I think Auburn's going to win the game. I'm not doubting myself on that. But the thing is that 7.5 is a bit much. I can see 7 on the nose, but I cannot see 8 plus. So yes, in the Kentucky and Auburn game, that one boiled down to 29 for Auburn, 13 for Kentucky. I recapped this one a little bit back in the first segment, but I was very wrong about that. I actually picked Kentucky plus 7.5. The line shifted to 6.5 right before the game started. But both ways, it didn't matter. I simply whiffed on this one. I thought Kentucky was able to hold Auburn a little bit. I knew that Kentucky had a good running defense, and they used that against Auburn. They held Auburn to 91 rushing yards. Kentucky actually, for the most part, outplayed Auburn. The thing about Auburn is that even though Bo Nix did not control the game, he didn't have, the most yards. He didn't have the best completion percentage, not the most time of possession. The thing that Auburn was able to do very well was use their defense to their advantage. And they were really able to hold Kentucky and put them in their place, which is, hey, you're not that great of an offensive team, and we're a team who has a very stout and very stubborn defense, and we're not going to let you go anywhere. And that was exactly Auburn's game plan, and it worked to perfection. Something I didn't see coming, honestly. And I am a little upset that I whiffed on that one, but my next two picks kind of redeemed themselves a little bit. So, number 21, Pitt beat number 24, Louisville, at a score of 23-20. I thought Malik Cunningham was going to keep this game close, and I was right. Well, kinda. The thing is that the bright spot on the Louisville Cardinals team was not Malik Cunningham at all. He was not playing well. 1 touchdown and 3 interceptions. 9 for 21, which is a 43% completion percentage, is not good. And Kenny Pickett, he didn't have the craziest game, but he put up an efficient game. 60.5%, 220 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a pick. Jordan Addison and Tasir Mack both had very efficient games. 7 receptions, 77 yards, and a touchdown for Jordan Addison, the wide receiver for Pitt, and 3 receptions, 62 yards, and a touchdown for Tasir Mack. Another very efficient game as well. But the thing that worked in Louisville's favor that really helped them out was the fact that Javion Hawkins really kept Louisville in this game. 13 rushes, 78 yards, and a touchdown. And the thing is that Pitt is a very good defensive team. It's like they learned something from when they had one of the greatest defensive linemen in the game right now, Aaron Donald, on their team. It seemed like, to me at least, Pitt had 4 Aaron Donalds on the field because they literally... It's an analogy that I feel like is used a lot. But Louisville's offensive line were like pylons. Or, to throw in a little more of a hockey analogy, and a bit of a soccer one as well, they were like Swiss cheese. Just giant holes everywhere for the defensive linemen to get through. And that's why Louisville got sacked 7 times by the Pitt defense, which, honestly, for a large chunk of it, is why Pitt was very effective throughout the game. Having 10 more first downs than Louisville also helped. Getting an extra 153 yards on offense also helped. Controlling the clock with over 10 extra minutes Pitt did really helped. And just being efficient on first down. Like, if you're Louisville, 1-11 is not good enough on third down. To be fair, 9-19 for Pitt is nothing crazy either. But at the same time, 47.4% is enough to keep yourself in a ball game. And if you're going to have 9%, then you might as well fold already. Because Louisville had a chance to win this game. But once again, it all comes down to what I said last week and how I decided that this game was going to go. And I'll just leave the clip here. At least in my point of view. 3 seems right. Yes, I did select Pitt to cover at -2.5. Just by half a point. That I won that. I personally won that bet by only half a point, but honestly, it's not about 2.5 or more. It's essentially 3 or more because you round up to the nearest whole. The last game that I picked last week was between Army, who was number 22 going into the game, and Cincinnati, number 14, also. The last game that I decided was between number 22 Army and number 14 Cincinnati. And Cincinnati had a good day against Army, 24-10. However, there were some big issues on this Army team that I thought weren't there the first time I watched them. They're there now. It's the fact that, number one, Army struggled on third down, 3 of 13. And the fact that they just could not get the ball in the air. I mean, 9 for 21 is not going to work. 94 yards in the air on 21 attempts is not going to work. On 21 attempts, 75% is 15. 2/3 is 14. But the thing is that 10 yards per throw is good, yes. But at the same time, they were getting hammered by turnovers. Army was. Because they lost a fumble. Their only touchdown was actually on defense. It was a fumble recovery from a touchdown by Jeopar Mauve. Literally the first Cincinnati possession, it was 50 seconds into the game. That was all of Army scoring and then a field goal. Not great for Army, honestly. But the thing is, Cincinnati, they didn't have a great game on offense. They had a decent game on offense. 18 for 33, which is 54.5% for Desmond Ridder. Jerome Ford got 8 rushes for 34 yards and a touchdown. But one of the biggest stats that really baffled me about Cincinnati is the fact that they got 10 tackles for loss. A whopping 10. It's hard enough to get 1, let alone like 3 or 4. But 10? Army's offensive line is the exact same issue that Louisville had on their offensive line. Louisville allowed 7 sacks. Army allowed 10 tackles for loss, which is essentially the exact same thing, except it's going to be a running back or receiver getting hit instead of the quarterback. Once again, Army's offensive line in this game, very porous. To bring up the analogies again, like pylons, just easily able to move over. Or like Swiss cheese with those big holes, you just run right through the middle. I'm just happy that Cincinnati was able to cover the spread because I did project Cincinnati covering and winning last week. I'm going to say Cincinnati wins, and I think they're going to, by the slimmest of margins, cover the spread. 14, 17 points. Yeah, so that was a thing. And I'm happy I was 2 for 3. That's a good ratio. And honestly, if I were to keep this up for the entirety of the season, like I pick 3 games per week and I get 2 every single week, that's a good rate. 2/3 right now is a great rate for a sports bettor. Because if you take high money on those bets, those 2, not only over the winnings of those 2 games don't just override the 1 loss, but they actually do create profit. Depending on how you play your ratios, depending on how the line plays out. I want to bring up how the spread was this past weekend. Once again, the spread is simply referred to as what's the number that the favorite is favored by. Out of 13 games I took into this equation, 2 of them, the team who was favored flat out lost. And that was Kansas State over Oklahoma and LSU losing to Mississippi State. Those were the 2 instances throughout the week where the favorite team just flat out lost. Now, something that's also quite rare is the fact that teams win and cover the spread, which means they win by the number that they were projected to win by or more. Florida, they won their game by 16. They were favored to win by 14. Miami, they were favored by 11.5. They won by 42. Oklahoma State were favored by 6, won by 14. And Virginia Tech was favored by 5.5. They won by 21. That's 4. We've gone through 6. The 7 remaining is the teams who won but didn't cover. Alabama was favored by Mizzou by 29 points. They won by only 19. Georgia was supposed to beat Arkansas by 28 points, only won by 27. And yes, if you don't get to 27.5, it has to be exactly over 27.5, has to go to 28, or else it's a loss. So Georgia's thing is technically a loss. Texas, they only won by 7 when they were favored by 17.5. Texas A&M, they were favored by 31.5. They were only favored by 5. UCF was favored by 28, only won by 23. Tennessee only won by 4, and they were favored by 4.5. Once again, that half point matters to avoid the tie. If this was 4 even, Tennessee would have pushed and essentially would have been a tie, and that's boring. So Vegas decided to make it interesting, add a half a point to the 4, and Tennessee loses by a half a point. Makes things so interesting. And Louisiana won by 2, and they were an 11.5 point favorite. Out of 13 games that were played this weekend, 4 of them, if you took the favorite to cover and win, that is a 4-13 shot. That is just under a quarter. So essentially from this past week, the move was to bet the underdog. Take the plus 29, take the plus 28, the plus 17, the plus 4.5, the whatever it was. Because that team, yes, they won and they didn't cover, or they lost, which is all you need. You either need them to win and not cover, or lose flat out. And literally that event happened 9 out of 13 times, which is just around 75%. Crazy, right? Let's go into the new bit of terminology before I get into my week's picks for my bets of the week. This week's betting terminology here on Put Your Money Where Your Mouth is called the moneyline. If you've ever been on a sporting website, you're going to see the spread, which is what we talked about last week, that plus-minus number, the money line, and the over-under. The over-under I will get to next week. But this week, I want to focus on the money line. The money line is a number. It's usually some sort of ratio or proportion or something like that. Predetermined, pretty much. It's actually very similar to the line, except you're not putting a point value on it. You are simply just picking a winner. So let's say, for example, Auburn and Georgia. There's going to be a certain number that's associated with each team. The money line with a minus in front of it, that is the favorites. And typically the winnings for picking the favorite is typically lower. If you pick the underdog, which typically has a plus in front of it on the money line, the ratio of winning is typically very high because of the underdog. They're not expected to win. So basically that's the way of saying, here's some extra reward for taking a chance on a team who maybe should not have won. The spread has a specified fixed point value. The money line, it just has to be 1 point. And that is it. 1 point, nothing less. If it's a tie, it's a tie. Both people get their money back. It's, once again, very lame, very boring. No one likes a tie. That's why people criticize the NFL overtime rules. Because no one wants a tie. That's why after 5 minutes of 3-on-3 overtime in hockey, they have a shootout to avoid ties. That's why, once again in hockey, the Columbus Blue Jackets and Tampa Bay Lightning can go in 5 overtimes because they don't want a tie. Soccer does it. It's very boring. But when the games actually matter, ooh, baby, extra time. And then when extra time is there, once the clock strikes the 120th minute, we got penalty shootouts because, once again, ties don't do anything. So if you want to be a little bit safer on your picks, and if you want to just simply pick a team to win, flat out, no numbers, no favorited by this, no calculating how much each team has to win here, you're simply picking a team, you're saying they win, and you're betting a money line. That's our sports terminology of the week here on Put Your Money on this segment of Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is. However, I'm going to really, really put my money where my mouth is because I'm about to take some numbers and I'm going to crunch them and I'm going to put them somewhere. Let's start with Oklahoma and Iowa State just for the sake of keeping a consistent order here. Oklahoma is favored by 6.5 by Iowa State. But the thing is that every single category that is presented to me favors Oklahoma one way or another. Oklahoma's had a top 10 offense in the entirety of the NCAA each of the last 2 years. It shows the genius of what Lincoln Riley can do at quarterback. Yes, once again, Spencer Rattler is a freshman. But he also leads the Big 12 in passing yards with 430 yards. That's a lot of yards. And the thing that's really keeping me from Oklahoma is looking at both the yards and the points. Because on offense, Oklahoma has a 200-yard advantage. 199. But let's just say for the sake of simplicity, it's 200. And in terms of the points, it is a 16-point differential on offense alone. That doesn't even include defense, where Oklahoma has the 13-point advantage and the 120-yard advantage over Iowa State. Unless Oklahoma just absolutely collapses, I cannot see a foreseeable future where Oklahoma does not win by 7 or more. I just cannot see it. It just, on paper, it makes too much sense. From the eye test, it makes too much sense. I've seen Iowa State play before. There's nothing crazy about them. They just know how to play football, and that's it. However, Oklahoma, they have all this crazy schemes going around. They have Spencer Rattler, who in 3 years' time is, if assuming he develops properly, could easily be an NFL quarterback in 3 years, assuming he develops properly. Lincoln Riley is a quarterback whisperer, and Spencer Rattler should absolutely go off on this Iowa State defense, because I want to utilize the biggest matchup that I think is going to take place is the 435 yards taken by Spencer Rattler on the air, which is number 1 in the Big 12, versus 277 yards against on Iowa State, which is 8th out of the 10-team Big 12. That deficit is going to be huge, and I think if Lincoln Riley plays this thing smartly, that's going to be the matchup to exploit. And if Spencer Rattler cannot have 3 interceptions, not have a touchdown, essentially stripped from them on the final drive because he threw a little bit out of the reach of his receiver, Oklahoma's going to take this one by 7 or more. I'll be bold. I'll say it's going to easily be 6.5. I'm not doubting it's 6.5. 6.5 is right. I think it's too low. I think if they want to take a chance, they should put Oklahoma closer to like 9.5 or 10. Maybe even 12.5 to 13. The second matchup is Auburn versus Georgia. Now, currently Georgia is the 6.5 point favorite. However, the SEC so far has only played 1 game thus far. And the thing that I want to focus on really is the discrepancy in the offenses. Because the defenses, for the most part, they are very similar. However, the offenses is where the discrepancy really lies. Because Auburn was able to score 29 on Kentucky, who was ranked. And Georgia was able to put up 37 versus Arkansas, who was not. Why I think this matters is because Georgia has a better offense versus a worse team. And Auburn was able to put some up against Kentucky, who kind of put them at a good fight. However, once again, my logic with Georgia is very similar to my logic with Oklahoma, which is that every single number presented, especially because we do not have enough to go off of right now, it's tough to go against Georgia because they looked absolutely phenomenal against Arkansas. they looked like they should be where they are. Kirby Smart has done an outstanding job with this team so far. Once again, only one game, but we will just see. I'm going to take Georgia minus 6.5. I will. I'm going to say the same thing that I said about Iowa State and Oklahoma. I think it should be a little closer to 9.5 or 10. Because that seems closer to what I think it should be and closer to what I think it actually will be. Closer to about a 10-point game instead of a 6-7-point game. And the last matchup I want to bring up is Bama versus Texas A&M. Well, currently Bama is favored by 16.5 points. Yes, Texas A&M only put up 19 points against Vanderbilt. Yes, Alabama absolutely steamrolled Mizzou with a 38-point game. And yes, Alabama's defense did give up more yards in almost every category except for rushing. However, you cannot forget, Nick Saban is a great defensive coach. If there's one thing that Nick Saban knows how to do at the college level, it's scheme and it's game plan on defense. Literally, the first great player from Alabama that's been drafted high in a long time is probably Tua. That's about it, really. And then ever since then, there's a bunch of duds at quarterback for Alabama. So if Alabama's going to win, it is not going to be through the air. It's going to be a lot of defense, a lot of turnovers. However, Texas A&M, when I saw that game versus Vanderbilt, they were stingy. 187 rushing yards is a lot to put up, especially on SEC teams where it's mostly great defense, with a lot of great defenses. I can see Alabama winning, but the issue is, will they cover the spread? Because 17 points is a lot. I'm going to say Bama wins, but I think it's going to be closer to about... I think it's going to be just shy. Honestly, 14 seems about right to me, and I feel like 17 is just a tiny bit much. The thing is, the way I see it, if Bama wins this game, it's going to be a slimmer margin than we expect. Maybe something like a 10, 13 or 14. And if it's 17, that means Bama played a complete game, and I'm willing to fess that up. But honestly, I think 16.5 is a little too much. Those are my predictions on the Week 5 matchups. And for the final segment that's going to be coming up right after the break, some of the top prospects that have moved on into the NFL: Joe Burrow, CeeDee Lamb, Tua Tagovailoa. Did them leaving their programs actually make their programs better or worse? Could their programs use guys like they had last year? And how are their respective programs coping with the losses of some of their big-name players? That's going to be coming up right after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
And we're back once again here on the GSMC College Football Podcast, here on the GSMC Podcast Network, once again with Ryan Lee. We have gone over the Week 4 recap. We have gone through the Week 5 preview. Another segment of Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is, where I talked about my favorite bets going into this week and how I did in last week's segment. But right now, we're going to be going into a little bit of an interesting one, where we're going to have a very interesting segment right here, because this is one that I think kind of has a massive effect on the way that a lot of these teams end up panning out, which is when a team winds up having a lot of players getting drafted, how do they end up doing the following season? I'm sure there are some talents where when they get drafted, it's absolutely devastating for a team. It's one of those things that maybe a team just isn't exactly ready for, but regardless, a lot of these players, they wind up running out of firepower, and maybe some of the losses are just too great for some of these teams to recover from. So we're going to break down a couple of these schools. I specifically have chosen 4 schools based on a certain criteria. Number 1, are they playing right now? I can't exactly pick a Big Ten school or a Pac-12 school because they haven't played a single game yet. We can't have any gauge as to how good or how bad they are since the departure of certain player or players, because they haven't played a single game yet. So literally that doesn't matter at all. So I believe I have 3 SEC teams and 1 Big 12. And I'm going to go through each of the prospects, go through who was drafted when, and just compare the stats so far. Do having these players leave, does it have an effect on them the year after? Does it affect the way that they recruit? Does it affect the way that they bring people in? Does it affect the way they develop players, etc.? Because in circumstances like the NFL draft, you can have juniors or seniors declare. And a lot of the guys that I'm going to be listing off, they have made it to the NFL level. Whether they were juniors or seniors, who knows? It literally doesn't matter. The thing is that the impact these guys have made on their respective teams, in some cases, they were so great that when they left, it literally devastated their programs. I'm going to start off with the Alabama Crimson Tide from last year. 11-2 a year ago. They were 8th in the final poll. They had 47.2 points for on offense, which was 2nd in the entirety of the nation. And their 18.6 points against was 13th in the entire nation. And they actually won the Citrus Bowl against Michigan without Tua, who actually got drafted 5th overall by Miami Dolphins. Some other notable Alabama players that were drafted includes the wide receiver tandem of Henry Ruggs and Jerry Jeudy. It includes cornerback Trayvon Diggs, and it includes a couple of other important players like Jedrick Willis, an offensive tackle. So far, through the one game that Alabama has had so far, they've done quite well for the most part. Currently, Mac Jones is sitting at 75% at 249 yards, at 2 touchdowns. And so far, Najee Harris is averaging 5.8 yards per rush and a trio of touchdowns so far, which is pretty good for the most part. However, the thing is that the player they left behind he should be an NFL level starter. The thing is, Mac Jones did play some games the year before after Tua got injured. Last year, Mac Jones went 68.8% on the completion and only 141 attempts. He already has 24 as it is, and Tua only played not that many games due to his hip injury. 1,500 yards and 14 touchdowns and 3 interceptions for Mac Jones, which is actually really good considering the fact that Tua got hurt early. He really did. And, CeeDee Lamb and Jerry Jeudy were the top receivers in that draft class, at least in terms of the standpoint of Alabama. The thing is that they also have some great talent still left over in the receiving corps. Right now, Jalen Waddle and Devonta Smith are both still in the Alabama lineup. That's the crazy thing, and they were the number 1 and number 4 receivers last year. The thing is that Jalen Waddle didn't really play much because he was overshadowed by Jeudy and Ruggs. Ruggs had 7 touchdowns, Jerry Jeudy had 14. Devonta Smith is the leading receiver from last year's squad at 1,200 yards and 14 touchdowns. He is still on the squad, and he already has 134 yards and 2 touchdowns through game 1. So at least in the terms of the Alabama Crimson Tide, the draft means nothing because they have found some guys who are easily willing and easily able to step up to the plate and get into the next level. The next school I'm going to focus on is Georgia. They lost a lot of players from last year's squad. Some of their draftees from last year include offensive tackle Andrew Thomas, who's at number 4 overall, Isaiah Wilson, DeAndre Swift, the running back for the Detroit Lions, and Jake Fromm, their starting quarterback, who actually went to the Buffalo Bills. Now, the thing about Georgia is that they're a very interesting team because they went 12-2 last year, 4th overall, and their bowl game was the Sugar Bowl. And Kirby Smart's team led them to 30.8 points for and 12.6 points against. That was first in the entirety of the NCAA, that Georgia defense. The thing is, Jake Fromm had a pretty good season, actually. 60.8% on completions, 2,800 yards, and 14 touchdowns on 5 interceptions. DeAndre Swift, 1,200 yards on 7 touchdowns. Add another 1 touchdown and 200 yards from the air. Those are just some of the notable players. The thing about the Georgia Bulldogs this year is that Stetson Bennett hasn't really shown much. That's the thing. Obviously, it's through 1 game, but 69%, 211 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 0 interceptions, which is pretty good, honestly, if you had to ask me. I think that's actually a pretty good. However, the issue is that their running back, Zamir White, he is a very different back than DeAndre Swift. Because the thing about DeAndre Swift that Georgia was able to use to their benefit was the fact that he averaged 9 yards a reception. That dual threat back that Jake Fromm was able to check down to whenever he had to. Stetson Bennett doesn't exactly have that in Zamir White. And so far, White seems more like that ground and pound type of guy. And the thing is that DeJuan Mathis has the second leading number of touches at 10 so far. But the thing is that he's been more of a... He has 4 yards. And the way I saw in the highlights, it seemed like they used him mostly in the 3rd and 1, 4th and 1 situations. So I'm not going to go crazy by anything yet. But obviously, this is all up to debate so far. Spencer Rattler backed up Jalen Hurts last year because Spencer Rattler, I believe, was a redshirt freshman last year. Jalen Hurts had an insane season. He had 3,800 yards, 32 touchdowns, and 8 picks. 1,200 yards on the ground with an extra 2 receptions. Oklahoma lost a lot of pieces, including the aforementioned Jalen Hurts. They also lost CeeDee Lamb. And that's actually it. They only lost 4 players. But the thing is that last year, CeeDee Lamb was an absolute burner. 1,300 yards and 14 touchdowns. No wonder why Jerry Jones reached so hard just to get him. Now the thing is that Marvin Mims and Charleston Rambo, they each have over 100 yards, as well as Austin Stogner. They each have well over 100 rushing yards already through game 1. and that pace can easily surpass Lands, but however, that's not sustainable. Spencer Rattler is going to have a tough task ahead of him because if he's having a game very similar to Texas Tech, not only is he going to struggle, not only the Sooners going to struggle, but these receivers might as well. Honestly, I'll expect great things from Oklahoma because Lincoln Riley knows how to work an offense. He's one of my favorite coaches out there right now. And honestly, I believe a lot in Lincoln Riley. The last team I'm going to focus on is LSU. They lost so many players. Joe Burrow, Justin Jefferson, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Just to name a few. There's so many players that LSU lost throughout the year. Clyde Edwards-Helaire was 1,400 yards, 1,800 yards from scrimmage in total, 17 touchdowns in total. And Joe Burrow had arguably the greatest season in NCAA football history. 76% on the completions, 5,600 yards, 60-6 is his touchdown to interception ratio, which is absolutely nuts. And don't even forget the fact that he added an extra 360 yards plus 5 touchdowns along with that. No wonder why they were so crazy this past, last year in their national championship won. They absolutely deserve that. The thing is that Miles Brennan is not near up to that standard yet. 3-2, 345, and 58.7. But the thing is, with that loss with Mississippi State, I think Ed Orgeron is missing those weapons a little bit, like the Edwards-Helaire's, like the Justin Jeffersons, even the Joe Burrows. I think he's missing them just a little bit because so far, Terrion Davis-Prince, he only has 3.9 yards a carry versus Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who's topping 6.5, which honestly is absolutely nuts. And the thing is that the leading receiver is Terrence Marshall right now for LSU. And the thing is, he was also the third best receiver at 671 yards, but he got 13 touchdowns last year. The thing is that Jamar Chase opted out due to personal reasons, largely due to the pandemic. But the thing is, in his 2 seasons so far, he's been outstanding. So the general consensus here is that it depends on the program, because some programs, they're able to overcome all of that adversity. They're able to overcome all of that loss that comes about from any given year, especially due to things like the NFL draft, which are really more or less out of your control. Every team in college will have a 4-year turnover eventually. That's literally inevitable. That's inescapable. But it seems like so far, some of the teams have been able to handle it better than others. And we'll just have to wait and see how that turns out in the long run. Thank you for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you remember to subscribe to the show, write a review, 5 stars, and it really helps us out. Also, if you can, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, not only the GSMC Podcast page, but the GSMC Podcast College Football pages as well. For the GSMC College Football Podcast and the GSMC Podcasting Network, my name is Ryan Lee. We'll see you back here on the second release of the week on Saturday. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of your nights.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.